Hi students, and welcome to the chapter 5, most of it anyway, lecture. Today we're going to be talking about species interactions and succession. So there's just some examples of species interaction, and we're also going to be talking about succession and island biogeography, which is going to relate to the two simulations we'll be doing in class. So there's two different types. There's interspecific and there's intraspecific competition. So the word inter is when two or more species use the same limited resource and adversely affect each other. So the results are often because of niche overlap, in requirements for food and resources. This is common between, we talked about invasive species in the last lecture. And so when invasive species come in, they often compete with the native species for the resources. And then there's intra-competition, which is competition within the same species. And then again, this can happen when resources are scarce. So if you look at these examples, if you're going to classify each example, the mice and the blue jays, they both feed on acorns. That would be interspecific competition because it's between two species. And then competition among squirrels for acorns and say the strawberries in my yard, that would be intraspecific competitions. The squirrels competing with me for my strawberries would be interspecific competition. There's the principle of competitive exclusion, and this dates back quite a ways. It showed that when two species with the same niche overlap, they cannot coexist indefinitely. And so they had in their Miller textbook, the example of the paramecium, that when you put them both separately, which is the upper picture, they both do fine. But when you put them together, one of the species totally outcompetes the other one. And same thing with the little mouse example in the lower left. So again, this can often happen when you introduce an invasive species to an area. Say there was the ants example that I saw on another slide where you bring in non-native ants, they might outcompete the native ants for the resources and drive them extinct. When you have ecosystems that are stable, that are in equilibrium, where you're not introducing invasive species, et cetera, there's something called resource partitioning, which means that over time, these species evolved so that they don't compete, because if competing is going to mean that something has to go extinct, it's better if you can learn to not compete for the resources. And so resource partitioning means that within an ecosystem, the different organisms there will use different resources in different ways, or in different places, or sometimes even at different times, like versus night versus day animals. And in this sense, you reduce that competition and you won't have things being driven extinct. So it's an evolutionary process, and it's a way for species to avoid that whole principle of competitive exclusion. So when the two species overlap, they'll be more likely to survive if they're not going to compete as much. This is a really strange picture, but I guess like the warblers will actually occupy different parts of a tree, and that's kind of amazing to me. Competition and the environment can also limit distribution. So you think of intertidal zones, you will have certain species have to live above the high tide mark, other species will live in that intertidal mark, and then other species have to be below water all the time. So that's another way that you can actually kind of partition who lives where. And this, again, should be reviewed from biology, but there's 3 different types of symbiosis. There's mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. And so pretty quickly, just run through these 3 types. Mutualism is when both of the species benefit. So they interact in a way that both get benefit from it. So, the tree provides the nectar for the ants, and the ants defend the tree from predators. There's various different types of examples of mutualism out there. Commensalism is where one species benefits and the other one's neither harmed nor helped. So one is not really affected and the other one is helped. So you see the little epiphytes growing on the trees. I've often wondered if like barnacles living on like whales and whatnot, if the barnacle gets the benefit of the getting to swim around with the whale and the whale's not really harmed by it, that would be commensalism too. Parasitism is when one species benefits and the other one's harmed. And so this is a gross slide, like ticks are one of my least favorite things. There's endoparasites that live inside the host and ectoparasites that live outside the host. And so when you're doing the host harm, that's parasitism. So you can see the various examples there. Okay, on to something a little bit less gross, succession. So succession is a gradual and fairly predictable change in species composition with time. The first one that comes in is called the pioneer species. They're the first species to colonize an area, and what that species is depends on whether you have primary or secondary succession. So this is a fairly predictable pattern, and you'll be looking at a little simulation in class that'll help define it better for you. But there's two main kinds. There's primary, which means you have a new community, like there was no life there before. So say Hawaii, lava flows, you make brand new ground, life has not been there before, that would be primary succession. Secondary succession, think about Mount St. Helens, where you had an ecosystem there, something wiped it out. In the case of Mount St. Helens, it was the volcanic eruption, and then the community has to reestablish itself. So if you notice in the case of Mount St. Helens down there that the big trees are gone, and you can see that what's coming back are not those big trees yet. So let's go through primary succession first. So, things like a newly formed volcanic island, or, a glacier that's been sitting on rock for a long time retreats, and there's nothing there because the glacier's been there for a long time. So generally early on, you get kind of like lichens and mosses because they can colonize the bare rock. And then over time, they break that rock up, make the soil, so you can start getting bigger plants. And then as soon as the plants get big enough, you can start bringing in insects and then larger animals. And then as far as the plants go, eventually the latest thing in succession are usually the big trees. Big trees need lots of soil, and generally they're going to be the last to come back in succession. So this is just a picture from the Galapagos that Ms. DeBrew took of just some primary succession stuff going on in that lava rock there. Secondary succession is a bit more common because you had an area that had life before and something disturbed it. So, abandoned farm fields, areas that are wiped out by floods, forest fires taking out an area, Mount St. Helens was another thing that could happen. So you have a similar progression, but generally it's easier to get the life returning in secondary succession because you're not starting with bare rock. The climax community is often also called the mature community. And this is kind of the end result, of what that's the big trees, the most biodiversity, et cetera. And it doesn't mean that makes it sound like that's the end thing, and then it's done. But, ecosystems will always evolve over time. So a disturbance. So I kind of ran through some of these on the other slide. What initiates that secondary succession? So, eliminating part or all of the existing communities. So you can have natural disasters like fires and hurricanes, et cetera, but where humans are also causing a lot of disturbances these days by deforesting, overgrazing, farming, et cetera. So just, looking at early versus late succession, the Shire versus, this is kind of a joke slide, but, primary, secondary succession, the lower picture looks like it would be pretty much primary succession. This looks like it's new rock. Okay, so what about looking at our last Unit 1 stuff, net primary productivity and succession? I'm not gonna have you go to this website, but I'm just gonna give you the answers. If you look at Doug fir and compare how much CO2 is taken out per year, you'll notice that there's actually kind of a peak in the mid zone of the growth of that tree versus you might think, well, wouldn't the big trees pull out more carbon? And the answer is no, not really. The small tree is not very big yet, so it's not going to be pulling a lot of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. But the big tree is kind of done growing. So while it's actually storing a lot of carbon and all that biomass of the huge tree, the tree that's going to pull the most carbon out of the atmosphere is going to be the one that's most rapidly growing. It's going to be the one that's adding the most biomass to itself. And so it's going to be that medium-sized tree. And this slide it's really pretty easy to think of, like if we ever asked you test questions or you had to describe the difference between early and late succession, there's a big trend here. With early succession, think small and simple. And with late succession, think big and more complex. So you can run down this list, and that holds true for every single one of those categories except for that last category that's not filled in yet. So plant size, low, small to large, diversity, low to high, all of those things go from small and simple with early succession to large and complex with late succession, except for net primary productivity. It's actually higher in early succession, lower in late succession. And it's like that tree example from the previous slide. But your mature community, again, it's going to be storing a lot of carbon because you have a lot of big trees, et cetera, but they're not growing as much. So they're not going to be pulling as much carbon. They're not going to be as productive as the early succession where things are really starting to take off. This just shows kind of in a graphical way, pretty much what that previous slide did. And you can look at from early succession to late successional and then relative changes. You can see the plant growth rate decreases as you go to late succession, but your species diversity go up. So this is kind of a simplified way to look at the previous slide that had the table. The theory of island biogeography. This one always seemed kind of obvious to me, but it's actually kind of a thing that we're going to be playing with this one with the simulation too. And it's a species equilibrium model called island biogeography. And it was based on stuff by E.O. Wilson, et cetera. And it's the idea that the number of species on an island is determined by the balance between immigration and extinction. So how many species are coming in versus how many are going extinct. And it's not just, they call it island biogeography, but you can apply it to any isolated ecosystem, like a forest preserve that's surrounded by people, et cetera. So how does it work? So there's a few things that might affect your balance between extinction and immigration. And one of them is how far are you from the mainland? So if you're a distant island, you're going to have a lower species diversity because you're not going to have as much immigration if you're really far. Seeds aren't going to be able to blow out to you, birds aren't going to be able to fly out to you, et cetera, as easily if you're far away from the mainland than if you're closer. So, and that should be pretty straightforward. The little graph that you see down there in the lower left, this basically just shows that if you're far away, this is the rate of immigration or extinction, and this is the number of species on the island, that the far island will have fewer species just because you're going to have less immigration. So what about island size? Okay, so this is another thing you can look at. Smaller islands are going to have lower species diversity, and there's a couple reasons for that. And again, looking at this picture down here, you have the large island is going to have more species than the small islands will. And there's two reasons for that. One is that immigration-wise, you're a smaller target, so you're not going to have as many species making it to you. But you're also going to have a higher rate of extinction potentially because you're smaller, you're going to have fewer resources. And then this gets at another idea called stability. So stability of ecosystems, there's kind of two key aspects. One is inertia or persistence, which is the ability to resist being disturbed or altered. So if you have a lot of inertia, you're not going to be disturbed. Resilience is the ability to come back from it. So if you are disturbed, resilience is your ability to come back from that. So when you think about tropical rainforests, you might think, oh my gosh, there's so much diversity there. And it says, do you think the following ecosystems would have a high or low inertial and high or low resilience? So if you break down what tropical rainforests actually are, they have really high diversity. They're well established. They're kind of that climax community. They're going to have high inertia. They're going to resist being changed because you have so much biodiversity there. Remember, the more biodiversity you have, the more ability you have to like stay stable. However, they're going to have low resilience, and that's because they have really poor soils. It turns out all of the nutrients, everything, are in the biomass. And so if you cut down a rainforest or burn down a rainforest, all those nutrients were stored in the biomass, and it's going to have a really hard time coming back. So they're worried with all of the burning down of the rainforests, et cetera, that's going on right now, that those rainforests may never come back. Grasslands, on the other hand, they're not as diverse, you know, they're prone to fires. They generally have really nice soils, which is why we do most of our farming in the former grasslands of the prairie states. And they have low inertia though. They're prone to fire, so that they're not as biodiverse. And so they're easily altered. However, they're highly resilient, though. They can come right back from a fire pretty quickly because they have, again, those nice rich soils. And so kind of we'll be hammering throughout various lectures just how underappreciated soils are. So again, less biomass, and so those nutrients can build up in the soil. So again, we do a lot of our farming in former grasslands. And that's the end of this lecture. So we'll go ahead and see you guys in class next time.